everyone, and welcome to my video where I'm going to showcase my senior capstone project that I worked on for my bachelor's in marine biology. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start with some basic background knowledge first. I grew up in Michigan, close to the lake, so I was surrounded by fresh water basically my whole life, but I was so interested in the ocean and how saltwater life was different than freshwater. So when I was applying to universities in high school, I would go on Google and search for universities that had marine biology programs or marine sciences, anything around in that field. And I would find ones on the coast, of course, like California, North Carolina, etc. But I actually found one on the island of Oahu that at the time had a free application day. So I was like, why not? Let's just apply. So I applied for it, not really thinking much of it. However, I ended up getting an acceptance letter from the university in Hawaii on the island of Oahu, along with a lovely large scholarship. At the time, my senior year of high school, I had an independent study with a teacher, which was great for me because I got to look at things that I was super interested in within the field of marine biology, marine sciences, and it was a really good introduction to what I wanted to study for the rest of my life. I ended up committing to Hawaii Pacific University on the island of Oahu for marine biology with my scholarship, and I ended up moving there when I was 17. Alone. So now more background on the school and what I did for my capstone project. HPU has their own research vessel. It's called the Kaholo. It goes out in Kaneohe Bay, and it's reserved for marine biology students, marine science, and oceanography, basically the ocean-related programs. I had a class in 2019, I think, and it was marine vertebrate zoology, and I took the lecture course and the lab, and for the lab, we took the Kaholo out, and we went free diving in the bay around a little patch reef to ID different families of fish, which was super fun, but it was actually the first time that I saw a feather duster, which I became very interested in. They were all over this patch reef that we went to, and I looked at my satellite on my phone and screenshotted it so I could remember where we were. When we started the conversation in my capstone course, we started talking about different options of what you could study, things you were interested in, and basically what you wanted to spend an entire semester learning more about. The goal of the capstone course was to come up with hypotheses, methods, carry out trials, and in the end make a final write-up paper. Mine ended up being like 22 pages long, as well as the final presentation in front of faculty, staff, and students. I was interested in the feather dusters, and I knew that they were at that particular reef that I went to for my past lab class. So instead of just focusing on one patch reef, I noticed that there were two others around the one that we originally went to. So I thought, is there a difference between them? So that's what I looked into. I wanted to see if there's a difference between each of the three reefs and what each feather duster was doing on the reefs. I originally went on the boat to help another group out at the time for their project, and then after they were done with their project, I got to survey the reef and see potential areas that I wanted to focus on and what I wanted to do. I noticed that there were more feather dusters on the windward side of the reef, which is closer to the fringing reef and the way the waves move to the shore. I noticed that there were more there on the windward than the leeward, which is closer to the mountains. So I decided to incorporate that into my project. Apart from the different sides of the reef, windward and leeward, that I noticed that day, I noticed the different type of coral species that there were in the bay. And I wanted to see if there was an overall difference between the commonality of them and how popular each feather duster were to each coral species along the three reefs. I'm going to incorporate a little bit of my final presentation PowerPoint into this video so you can see a little bit more of how I presented this to everyone. So my overview is that I wanted to look at the habitat of the featherdusters and to see the side of the reef, like I just talked about, windward and leeward, as well as each coral species that they were by. I wanted to see how 3 patch reefs that were in close proximity to one another differed. So I will note that the Hawaii Division of Aquatic Resources has different reef number nomenclature that was already provided for each of the reefs in Kaneohe Bay. So that numbering system can be seen here as Reef A was number 16, Reef B was number 15. Reef B, by the way, was the one that I originally went to when I saw featherdusters for the first time, and Reef C was number 14. So as I previously talked about, I was looking at the windward and leeward side of each patch reef. Back to this picture, you can see at the top of each reef, which is the windward side, has 2 transect lines marked out, and then 2 at the leeward side, the bottom, has 2 other transect lines marked out as well. So each transect was 15 meters long and 2 meters wide. We set out a transect rope that was individually marked at every half meter, and that's where I would take a photo on my GoPro of what was there and what featherdusters, if any, were around there at the time. The 2 meters wide part was just how far your arms went, you know, like this on each side. That's basically 2 meters. So we had 2 transects on the windward and 2 transects on the leeward side. So this is an example of what the slate looked like. It was a rough outline of each transect that we did, the first 2 being windward and the last 2 being the leeward side. Recorded the counts on that slate, as well as had video footage that was just rolling for like B-roll. So I ended up finding that the featherdusters were near certain coral species. I made categories for each of the most common types. So this is the coral species Parietes compressa, and this is the featherduster on it right there. And then on the right is the coral species Montipora capitata. So those are the 2 main coral species categories. I also found featherdusters in between Parietes compressa and Montipora capitata, and I made that into its own category. We also had Coraline algae, and one that was found between Parietes compressa and Bacillopora damicornis. And we have another category where they are found between Montipora capitata and Coraline algae. So those were the main ones that featherdusters were found on within those 3 patch reefs. We had 4 other categories that they were never found on, including sand, rubble, which is like broken coral, and then Bacillopora mandrina and Fungidae. So that comes to my hypotheses. I ended up having 2. First off, the null being that there was no difference between the windward and leeward side of the reefs, as well as no difference between the 3 reefs. The first hypothesis that I had was that if featherdusters are present, then they will be denser on the windward side of the reef. The next null was that there would be no difference between what coral species the featherdusters were located on. For my second hypothesis, it stated that if featherdusters are present, then they will be denser on the coral species Parietes compressa. And I predicted that they prefer Parietes compressa because it mimics the tube-like structure that the featherduster turns into when it retreats. Okay, so now the results. I combined my data from the windward and leeward side, as well as combining each of the 3 reefs' individual data to make the combined reef data of the coral species that each featherduster was by. As you can see on the left, I displayed this data in a bar graph. The x-axis was the percentage, and the y is the coral species. Previous categories that I talked about for each of the different coral species. The blue bar indicates the coral species the featherdusters were on, and the orange bar indicates the coral cover. As I mentioned previously with the method section, every half meter I recorded the species of coral that was found there on the transect line that was 15 meters long. And that went to creating the overall coral coverage, which can be seen with the orange bar. Now, as you can see, the most common is Parietes compressa for the coral species that the featherdusters were on, as well as the coral coverage. Now, the reason I had to display the coral coverage as well was because, of course, there's going to be more featherdusters if that's the only coral species available. So that's why I had to display coral coverage, how much coral species there is compared to each coral species that the featherduster was on. I'm going to focus on Parietes compressa because, as you can see with the blue line, coral species that the featherdusters were on was about 10% greater than the coral coverage. So you would think that statistically the test would show that Parietes compressa was the preferred coral species. However, I did a chi-squared test and it yielded no significance. Now for this section, as results are, you just display your results and don't really talk about the discussion aspect of it. I will get to that later, but we're just going to move right on to the results that I had for the windward and leeward side data. So in this graph, I also had a bar graph. As you can see, the three different graphs are laid out as A, B, and C, as well as the different reef nomenclature of being reef 16, 15, and 14 respectively. On the x-axis, we have the windward and leeward side, windward being green, leeward being blue, and on the y-axis being the density, which is number per meter squared. To test this data, I did a two-way ANOVA, which tested the factors of the windward versus leeward side and the difference between each of the three reefs. It showed a significant difference between the sides of the reef, being windward and leeward. However, it did show that there was not a significant difference between the three reefs. Now, moving on to the discussion of it all. Visually, there's a huge difference between the reefs. As you can see, Reef C is much larger in size compared to the other two reefs that were surveyed. Reef C has the sandy area in the middle, which has less coral cover, compared to the denser outer edges, which was circled where the transects were located. To get from one transect from the leeward side to the windward side, we crossed over the middle part of the patch reef. So I know that it's much less dense, has lots of rubble, sand, collector urchins, sea cucumbers, compared to the more dense coral coverage area as the other reefs. Only similar part of Reef C to the reefs A and B is what I circled in red, which is where we did the transects. So since I chose to put the transect lines in a preferable location on Reef C, I possibly think that I skewed the ANOVA factor testing for the difference between the three reefs. Now let's move on to a little bit more of the discussion. For the first hypothesis, I'm overall not convinced enough to reject the null hypothesis. There's decent evidence that there is a difference between the reefs, like mentioned in the last slide. The overall ideal sample would be to sample the whole reef, but I only had enough time to do 4 transects, so it would have been ideal to do a great more amount of testing. As you can see on Reef B, there's a huge difference between windward and leeward side, so it's thought that this skewed the ANOVA factor to be significant. Visually looking at all of this, it's not a very representative statistic, because all the other data, you can't really tell there's a huge difference. However, it is still statistically significant. I'm just saying that more transects would be ideal to decide if there is a difference between windward and leeward side. Continuing on with the discussion, in a way it has been accepted because there were more featherdusters on Parietes compressa compared to the other species. However, when comparing the coral coverage to test for the significant difference, there was not one, since it's the most dominant coral species among the reefs. That's why we counted the coral coverage like I previously said. Parietes compressa did have the highest percentage that the featherdusters were on, but it's not significant enough to state that featherdusters prefer that species over others, just that the number of featherdusters were more on that species. My overall concluding statements is that the Hawaiian featherdusters habitat is not well studied in the wild, academically at least. For my final write-up, I had to look up a lot of academic papers and find different methods and things that they use to study featherdusters. Not many people have. A lot of people, if they have studied them, took them out of their habitat and studied them in a lab. I honestly couldn't find any that talked about the species of coral. Not many people are describing the habitat in the wild like I looked at. Overall, there's no concluding evidence that suggests that they prefer a particular coral type, since Parietes compressa was the most dominant species among the reefs. The windward side of the reef was statistically significant. Like I said, more data and more transects would be ideal. And even though the statistical evidence states that there is not a difference between the reefs, I did skew that data a little bit, so from my visual observations, there is a difference between the reefs. I just wish I had more time to sample the whole patch reefs rather than just 4 transects. Okay, so that's the breakdown of my capstone project, what I did, what I studied, my results, my discussion part of it. Obviously, this is a quick version of it. You didn't read the 22-page paper that I had. I did get an A on the class. I think I got like a 93 on my paper. Of course I didn't get 100. No one gets 100. There's always room for improvement. Having all that said, that's the data behind it all. Since I was videoing everything that I did, I have a lot of fun footage. I think that's very important to show because you have what I just talked about, the whole data analysis, statistical testing, Excel documents. There's so much trial and error that I had over the course of the semester, which is very important to showcase if you're interested in marine biology, but it's also very important to showcase the fun side of it. So let's move on from this data-specific line of conversation and move on to something a little bit more fun.
find the loudest tease. We set down by the fire, knowing we could aim higher, but we didn't know that yet. So if you want something to hold on to, gotta find it first. But here I am, 'cause I've been laying under palm trees, waiting for the summer, knowing there's nowhere to go. 'Cause I am happy on this island, wanna be my farmland. I don't ever want to leave, I'm in a tropic club. I remember the ocean, memories die out too hard. But we were traveling the mountains just to find the loudest tease. We sat down by the fire, knowing we could aim higher.
So that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed my capstone project as much as I did. If I decide to get my master's, I'm not sure at this moment, but if I do, I would love to go back to Hawaii, focus more on feather dusters, make that into my thesis, and that would be great. So yeah, that's that. Of course, if you have any questions of marine biology, more about my project, etc., comment down below and I'll try and get back to you. Otherwise, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and if you're thinking of studying marine biology, do it because it's great. Okay, I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.
Guys, it's happening.
First of all, I'd just like to thank you for a great semester. It's always really exciting to do this class and see the different projects that people come up with. We had a very novel project. I haven't seen anyone work with feather dusters before. The last thing is, there's been a number of cool photos. So I'd just like to see if we'd like to have a class vote on what the coolest photo was. I think there's a couple contenders. We have all these amazing photos of the feather dusters. Great job, everybody. So give yourselves a hand and a pat on the back.